The shriek of the steam engine echoed across the dry Kansas plains, a sound that made even the sparrows in the rafters of the depot scatter into the hot August sky. The train hissed as it came to its final halt at Abilene Station, a swirl of coal smoke and dust rising around the weathered wooden platform. Passengers spilled out, merchants with sample cases, women in travel-worn dresses clutching their children, cowhands heading west in search of wages. They hurried off with purpose, boots clattering against the boards, voices rising above the steady pant of the locomotive. When the crowd thinned, only one woman remained. Clara Bennett stood motionless on the platform, her bonnet shading a face flushed from the relentless summer heat. She held her infant daughter, Lydia, close against her chest, pressing her lips to the child's downy hair as though the tiny heartbeat was the only tether keeping her steady. 6 months old, Lydia fussed weakly in her mother's arms, her cheeks pink with heat, and her small fists curling restlessly against the fabric of Clara's traveling dress. Clara had come all the way from Boston, traveling nearly 2,000 miles by rail with nothing but a trunk, a baby, and a promise. That promise was supposed to be waiting for her here, Edward Mallory, the man who had written letters full of kind words and assurances, the man who claimed he wanted to marry her and give Lydia a home. But as the last passenger disappeared into the dusty streets of Abilene, Clara's heart began to sink. The station master, a lean man with sunburnt skin and a broom in hand, paused in his sweeping. He looked at her with something like pity, as if he had seen this scene too many times before. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "train's been in for near an hour now. If your fellow was coming, he'd have shown by now." Clara swallowed hard, fighting back the sting of tears that threatened to rise. Perhaps there's been a delay," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or a misunderstanding." The station master shook his head, setting the broom against the wall. His expression was firm but gentle, as though he hated being the bearer of bad news. "No misunderstanding, ma'am. Mr. Mallory packed up his wagon just yesterday, headed west, said California was more to his liking." The words landed like a blow. Clara swayed slightly, clutching Lydia tighter, and steadied herself against the iron handle of her trunk. She felt her knees weaken as the truth settled like a weight inside her. Edward Mallory had abandoned her. He had never intended to keep his word. The Boston girl in her wanted to weep, to collapse right there on the boards, and give in to despair. But the mother in her, the woman forged by loss, by necessity, by the tiny life in her arms, would not allow it. She drew a shaky breath and lifted her chin, though her hands trembled. "Is there a hotel nearby where I might wait?" she asked softly, still clinging to the hope that perhaps some mistake could be undone. The station master hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, there's the Willow House down the way. But truth be told, ma'am, you might want to stop at the sheriff's office first. Mallory left something there for you." Her heart clenched. Something he left behind? A letter, money, or just a final insult to remind her how little she mattered. Clara swallowed again, nodding faintly. Before the station master could say more, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from beyond the platform. A tall figure rode into view on a sturdy bay horse, dust rising in his wake. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, spurs jingling as his boots struck the boards. His broad shoulders filled the doorway of the depot, his presence commanding in a way that made Clara's pulse quicken despite herself. He wore denim worn pale from years of sun and work, leather chaps scuffed from long days on the trail. His face was half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the square jaw, the scruff of several days' beard, and eyes, blue as the Kansas sky, focused sharply on her. "Afternoon, Pete," the man greeted, his voice deep and resonant. "Any packages come in for the Carter Ranch today?" "Nothing today, Elias," the station master replied, jerking his chin toward Clara. "But we got ourselves a bit of a situation." The man, Elias Carter, turned his attention fully to Clara. The weight of his gaze made her feel as though he could see straight through her defenses, straight into the panic and exhaustion she tried desperately to hide. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with a respectful nod, "looks like you could use some assistance." Lydia, as if sensing the moment, broke into a full-throated cry. Clara bounced her gently, whispering soothing words, but the baby's wails grew louder. The heat, the dust, the hunger. It was too much. Clara's composure faltered, her voice trembling as she answered, I'm fine, thank you." Elias studied her quietly. He had seen his share of hardships in his 30 years, cattle drives gone wrong, neighbors lost to fever, friends buried too young. But the sight of a woman, so young, so clearly abandoned, standing alone with an infant on a scorching platform, stirred something in him he could not ignore. He stepped forward, his movements measured, careful not to startle her. "That little one needs shade, and you look about ready to faint. My wagon's just around the corner. Let me take you to the sheriff's office, and we'll sort this out proper." Clara hesitated. Everything in her upbringing told her never to accept help from a strange man. But the truth loomed large. She had nowhere to go, no money for lodging, no one in this unfamiliar town to turn to. The infant in her arms whimpered with hunger, her tiny face red with effort. Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the tremor in her voice. "I don't even know your name, sir." "Elias Carter, ma'am. I run the Carter Ranch 5 miles outside of town. Ask anyone here, they'll vouch for me." The station master nodded in confirmation. "Elias is good people, miss. One of the most respected ranchers in the county." For a long moment, Clara weighed her dwindling choices. Finally, she drew in a steadying breath. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I would appreciate your assistance. My name is Clara Bennett, and this," her voice softened as she glanced at the bundle in her arms, "is Lydia." Elias's mouth curved into a small, reassuring smile. "Pleased to meet you both. Now, let's get you out of this heat." He reached for her trunk with one hand, hefting it easily, then extended his other to steady her elbow as she stepped off the platform. His gentleness contrasted with the raw strength in his grip, and for the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt a flicker of safety. Around the corner his wagon waited, a sturdy vehicle shaded by a canvas cover. Elias set her trunk in the back, then glanced at the squirming infant. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward Lydia. Clara hesitated only a heartbeat before placing the child in his arms. To her surprise, Lydia's cries quieted almost instantly. The baby stared wide-eyed at Elias's beard and the glint of silver on his hatband, cooing softly as he cradled her with practiced ease. "You seem experienced with children," Clara remarked, astonishment softening her voice. "Helped raise my younger sisters after Ma passed," Elias said simply. "Learned quick that babies like movement and something new to look at." He handed Lydia back, then climbed onto the wagon bench beside Clara. With a snap of the reins, the horses pulled them into the heart of Abilene. The main street unfolded before her, a dusty thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings, the kind she had only read about in dime novels back east. Women in calico dresses carried baskets from the general store. Men leaned against hitching posts outside the saloon. A small lending library, a schoolhouse, and the steeple of a church gave the town an air of permanence despite its rough edges. "It's not much," Elias said, noticing her curious glances. "But it's growing. Got ourselves a school now, a doctor who don't double as undertaker, even a library." Despite herself, Clara smiled faintly at his attempt at humor. "It seems quaint." "That's a polite way of putting it," Elias chuckled. "Boston, right? Your accent gives you away." Clara stiffened slightly. "Yes, though I haven't much to return to there." Elias didn't press for details. Instead, he pointed out landmarks as they rolled past, speaking with the ease of a man deeply rooted in his community. His presence beside her, steady, unhurried, was strangely calming. All too soon, the wagon stopped before a modest building with "Sheriff" painted in black letters across the door. Elias hopped down, offering his hand once more. Clara accepted, her fingers trembling in his grip. Together, they crossed the threshold into whatever fate awaited her. The sheriff's office smelled faintly of gun oil and coffee gone bitter on a stovetop. A single window let in a slab of afternoon light that cut across the desk, catching in a swirl of dust. On the back wall hung a faded map of Dickinson County, a tin star nailed through the county seat as if to anchor law to the land. The man behind the desk rose as Clara and Elias entered. He was broad-shouldered but not tall, with a neatly kept salt and pepper mustache and eyes that had seen more than they cared to count. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, not quite a salute. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm Sheriff Caleb Morgan. You must be Miss Bennett." Clara adjusted her hold on Lydia, who had settled into a damp-cheeked doze after her crying fit. "Yes, Sheriff, Her voice snagged. She swallowed. "I was told Mr. Edward Mallory left something here for me." Morgan's expression thinned, sympathy tugging at one corner of his mouth. "He did. He opened a drawer, withdrew a thick envelope, and set it on the desk like it weighed more than paper should. Arrived yesterday, just ahead of him, hitching west. Said it needed to be handed to a Miss Clara Bennett, due on the noon train out of Topeka Line. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the envelope. Elias stepped quietly closer without touching her, the human equivalent of a brace. She broke the seal, cheap wax, gritty under her nail, and unfolded a single sheet. Miss Bennett, circumstances have changed. Upon reflection, I am not suited to the commitments we discussed. I have set course for California. Enclosed, please find Twen to assist with your return. I wish you and the child every good fortune. Edward Mallory. The words were tidy and bloodless. They might as well have been ledger entries. A crisp bill slipped into her palm when she tipped the envelope. $20 that suddenly felt both insult and lifeline. Clara read the letter again, slower this time, hoping by some miracle the script would rearrange itself into the promise she had crossed the continent to find. It did not. Heat crawled up her throat. She closed her eyes against the sting. "I'm sorry, miss," Sheriff Morgan said quietly. "Man's got a right to change his mind, but a promise should still mean something. Around here, most folks think so." Lydia stirred, rooting against Clara's bodice, hungry, hot, and confused. The motion grounded Clara more than any kind word could. She folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope with the bill, and tucked both into her reticule. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. "Thank you, Sheriff. Is there a boarding house in town where I might stay until I arrange passage east?" She made herself say east, though the word tasted like chalk. Morgan hesitated. "There's Mrs. Ellery's on Walnut. Reputable place, but—" He cleared his throat. "She don't take in babies. Says it's on account of the other ladies need their sleep for work." Of course. Respectability drew its lines in ink, and women like her were usually on the wrong side of it. "I can pay," Clara added quickly, though the 20 in her reticule felt small for the miles between Boston and here. The sheriff lifted a hand. "Not about the money, miss. It's her rules." Silence collected in the room like silt after rain. Then Elias spoke, his voice even, as if he were discussing fence wire instead of the future. "Miss Bennett can stay out at the Carter Ranch. We've got the old line cabin by the cottonwoods. Tight roof, good stove. My sister Rose is at the house this month. She'll see to proper chaperonage." He glanced at Clara, not at the sheriff. "It'd be honest work and fair wage if you're willing. Help in the kitchen, mending, whatever you're comfortable with. Lydia'll have shade and milk on the stove every hour." Clara blinked. The offer was so straightforward, it took a second to reach her. "Mr. Carter, I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Elias said, the hint of a smile in his voice, but not his eyes. "It's neighbor sense, and I can use an extra pair of hands. Rose says the men'll mutiny if supper keeps turning out like last Tuesday's." Sheriff Morgan tried and failed to disguise his smirk. "Rose burned the biscuits again?" "Hard enough to shingle the bunkhouse," Elias replied. The exchange loosened something tight in Clara's chest. Humor, humanity. It kept the room from tilting. Morgan sobered. He looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett, I won't pretend there won't be talk. Folks in any town chatter, and Abilene's no different. But Carter's name still stands for something here. If he says you're a hired lady and a guest under his roof, most'll keep their opinions to themselves. The rest—" He shrugged a sheriff's shrug. "The rest can learn manners or speak to me about it." Clara glanced down at Lydia, who had fallen into a milk dream, lashes black fans against flushed skin. Pride had carried Clara through miles of track and nights of rocking a colicky infant in a swaying berth. But pride never kept a baby fed. She looked up at Elias, dust still on his hat brim, sun-browned lines at the corners of sky-blue eyes, and saw not a savior, but a solid road when all she'd had was broken track. "If your sister agrees," Clara said, "then yes. I would be grateful for the work." Elias tipped his head once, businesslike, though something like relief flickered, quick as a lark's wing, across his features. "Then it's settled." Sheriff Morgan produced a ledger slip, scribbled quickly and slid it across. "Just a note you came by and received the letter. If you need anything, send word." He lowered his voice. "This town will mind itself better for having more good women in it." Clara signed with a hand steadier than she felt. "Thank you, Sheriff." Back in the brightness, the street had turned the color of baked bread. Elias lifted her trunk into the wagon as easily as if it were a sack of oats and helped Clara up. As they turned toward the general store, people paused in their errands, curious, not cruel, but curious was sometimes just a polite coat thrown over a sharper thing. Inside Harlan's General Mercantile, the air smelled of molasses and rope. Shelves of enamelware and bolts of calico marched along walls. Mr. Harlan himself, a barrel of a man with a tidy apron and a bald head that shone like polished apple, beamed when Elias stepped in. "Carter, you're late for your salt order." "Ran into business," Elias said, nodding toward Clara and Lydia. "Mr. Harlan, this is Miss Clara Bennett. She'll be boarding at the ranch. We'll settle her account tonight." "Welcome, Miss Bennett," Harlan boomed, as if volume alone could shield against judgment. "We've got Boston tea and Kansas grit in stock both." Clara managed to smile. She gathered soap, a hairbrush, a few pins, cotton for Lydia. When Harlan rang the total, Elias laid cash on the counter before she could reach her reticule. "Please," Clara protested, heat creeping up her throat. "Advance on wages," Elias said mildly. "You'll square me by next week and scold me for buying too much coffee." A tinkling bell announced a new arrival. A woman in a plum silk visiting dress swept in, the sort of gown that carried the East on its hems, even if the East wouldn't claim her anymore. She was fine-boned and handsome in the severe way of bank ledgers and early church pews. "Mr. Carter," she inclined her head without bending it. "I do hope the ranch's account remains as punctual as ever." "Mrs. Pritchard," Elias replied, dry as pasture dirt. "As always." Her gaze flicked to Clara descending over travel-wrinkled bodice, the sleeping baby, the plain bonnet tied all the way to her throat. The corner of Mrs. Pritchard's mouth lifted a fraction. "And you must be our new guest." "Miss Bennett," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "I'll be working for Mr. Carter's sister." "How civic-minded," Mrs. Pritchard murmured. "Abilene does so benefit from the charitable impulses of our gentlemen ranchers." "Seems to me," Harlan put in, loud enough for the street, "Abilene benefits from any soul willing to earn their way." Mrs. Pritchard's lashes lowered, the closest she'd come to a flinch. "Good afternoon," she said coolly, and drifted to the dry goods as if borne by perfumed wind. Outside again, Clara let breath seep from between her teeth she hadn't realized she was holding. Elias set the parcels in the wagon and offered his hand. "Pay Mrs. Pritchard no mind," he said, climbing up beside her. "She measures people like coin, by weight and shine. I've found better currency." They left town behind, church spire, smithy smoke, the promising square of new schoolhouse. The land opened like a prayer. Big sky, a quilt of prairie stitched with wind, grass heads just beginning to gold. The road rose and fell, and with each mile, something nodded inside Clara unwound a turn. "It's beautiful," she said, more to the road than to Elias. "It'll do," he answered, but the smile that slid into his voice said he loved it like blood. "First time Pa brought me out, I thought it was the loneliest place God ever made. Then I realized it's only lonely if you are. Land doesn't make a man alone. He does." They topped a low rise, and the Carter Ranch spread in a tidy fan below, a two-story white house fronted by a deep porch, a red barn with straight shoulders, long, low bunkhouse, two corrals busy with a shine of horseflesh, and the thread of a creek flashing between cottonwoods like a ribbon flung by a child. Elias snapped the reins gently, and the team clattered into the yard. A woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. She was perhaps 24, with a tumble of chestnut hair pinned with optimistic pins and eyes as blue as Elias's, though hers were sharp with mischief. "About time," she called. "If you forgot yeast again, I swear, Elias." She stopped dead when she saw Clara, then Lydia. The towel went still in her hands. "Oh." Elias stepped down, then turned to help Clara alight. "Rose, this is Miss Clara Bennett, and her daughter Lydia. They'll be staying a spell. Miss Bennett's taking kitchen work, if she'll have us." Rose's eyes softened. She descended the porch and, without fuss, peered at the baby. "Well, aren't you a peach?" she murmured, reaching one careful finger to Lydia's tiny palm. The baby gripped it like a lifeline and sighed. Rose looked up, and the mischief became resolve. "Miss Bennett, welcome to the Carter place. Elias exaggerates my culinary failings, but only a little. If you can teach my biscuits not to die on the pan, you're a miracle we've been praying for." Clara laughed, an unsteady sound, half relief, half unbelief. I can try. Good. Rose looped her arm through Clara's as if they'd known each other longer than a minute. Let me show you the cottonwood cabin. We had it scrubbed last month. Fresh straw tick. Elias, fetch the trunk. And don't bang the door. Hinge is loose. Yes, ma'am, Elias said, and the grin he didn't hide this time nicked Clara right under the ribs. The cabin sat under two old cottonwoods that whispered even when the air was still. Inside, sunlight fell across a neat room, a small iron stove with a blacked kettle, a table and two chairs, a braided rug, and a bed made up in a simple blue quilt. Someone, Rose, had set a vase of prairie asters on the windowsill. In the corner, a wooden cradle, its rails smooth with generations of tiny palms. My father built that cradle when Elias was born, Rose said, seeing Clara notice. It's steadier than it looks. We haven't had need of it lately. Her expression flickered, something wistful, unnamed, but the smile returned quick. You'll do for supper what you can, and not a lick more tonight. You've had a day and a half. Clara traced a finger down the cradle's worn edge. Thank you, she said, and this time her voice didn't wobble. For all of this. Rose's reply was matter-of-fact, but her eyes shone. We've all been new somewhere, Miss Bennett. It's a hard road made easier when someone sets a lantern out. They settled Lydia in the cradle with a soft flannel Rose found in a drawer. The baby, as if finally convinced the ground would stop moving, sighed herself into sleep. By late afternoon, Clara had rolled up her sleeves, tied on an apron, and found the kitchen, as if kitchens everywhere were cousins. She sifted flour through her fingers, silk-sifted, not lumpy, and cut in lard till it looked like pea gravel. She dipped buttermilk cool as a creek. Rose watched with the attention of a scholar and the impatience of a woman who had never had to wait for her hunger to be answered by science. Not too much mixing, Clara said, patting the dough tenderly. Biscuits are shy. You handle 'em rough. They sulk. Rose snorted. I must have offended 3 generations worth. When Elias came in from the yard, dust haloed his hat brim and his sleeves were rolled to his forearms. He stopped short, breathing in. Something smells like mercy, he said reverently. Don't encourage her, Rose said, but pride had bloomed high in her cheeks. Set the table and wash. Supper was stew rich with onions and beef and a whisper of bay. Rose had hoarded like a secret, skillet biscuits that rose proud and brown, and coffee that would wake a dead man. The bunkhouse crew ate at their long table. Elias, Rose, and Clara sat in the front room, windows open to the last of the heat. Conversation traveled light and easy, hopping from weather to cattle prices to the new school teacher's habit of reading newspapers aloud to anyone who'd sit. After, while Rose took plates, Elias crouched by the cradle. Lydia had woken, fists windmilling, eyes huge. He did not reach for her, not first, not without looking to Clara. When Clara nodded, he slid his hands beneath the baby with the certainty of a man who remembered how small things felt. Howdy, little one, he said softly. You ate better than I did, I swear it. Lydia gurgled like a creek. Something warm and dangerous slid beneath Clara's ribs again. Not romance, she was too tired for fairy tales, but recognition. A man who could carry a day's work in his shoulders and still make room for gentleness. Evening fell in steps. The land cooled, pink to purple to a blue that felt like velvet. From the porch, the prairie spread out so wide, Clara's thoughts uncoiled to fit it. Crickets tuned up. A coyote yipped on the far ridge and got told off by 2 ranch dogs who took their duties personally. Come see, Elias called from the yard. Clara stepped out. He pointed up, hat in hand. The sky had gone dark enough to show the first brave stars, pricked like promises. Back east, you get a handful, he said. Out here, you get a bucketful. Clara tipped her face to the vastness and felt for the first time in months something like breath reach the bottom of her lungs. It didn't fix anything. It didn't need to. It just made room. Behind them, Rose leaned in the doorway, towel over one shoulder. They posted the notice today, she said, as if remarking on pie. Harvest social in 2 weeks. Music, pie auction, men claiming to know how to dance and proving otherwise. Elias groaned. Last year, I got trampled by a banker. You should come, Rose told Clara. It's good to be seen where you choose, not just where you land. Clara traced a seam in the porch rail with her fingertip. I don't know that I have anything suitable to wear. Rose waved a hand. We'll see to it. Mrs. Harlan owes me a favor for pretending her gooseberry jam didn't break my tooth. They laughed, the kind of laughter that stitches small tears so they don't widen. When quiet settled again, Clara realized she was swaying, bone-deep tired, the kind that makes even joy heavy in the arms. "Go on," Rose said gently. "Sleep while you can. Out here, morning shows up like it's been running to get to you first." Clara lifted a sleeping Lydia from the cradle and carried her to the bed in the cabin, laying her down in the gentled cradle instead. She smoothed the flannel, brushed a curl from the baby's forehead, and stood for a moment, listening to the cadence of her daughter's breath. Then she sank onto the mattress and let the day rise and fall away like the tide. Outside, the ranch settled into night sounds. On the porch, a man who had not expected his day to include a stranger and her child sat with his hat in his lap and looked up at the sky until the stars came sharp and sure. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't have to. Some things say themselves when you sit still long enough. And in a cottonwood cabin, a woman who had crossed more miles than she could count slept for the first time in too long, with her hand on the side of a cradle her child did not fall out of, under a roof she did not fear would give way. Tomorrow would bring new reckonings, town eyes, hard words, choices that always seemed to cost. But tonight, the Carter place held, and sometimes that is how lives turn. Not with a shout, but with a door that opens and stays that way. The wagon rattled along the prairie road, wooden wheels crunching over limestone gravel, the horses' harness bells jingling a rhythm against the wide Kansas sky. Clara held Lydia close, careful to shade the baby's face beneath the bonnet, though the August sun still burned the crown of her own head through fabric. She had read about the Great American Plains in Boston newspapers, but no ink could prepare her for the way it opened in every direction, like standing at the edge of eternity, with nothing to stop you from falling straight into it. For a woman used to narrow streets hemmed by brick row houses, the horizon was almost terrifying. Yet beneath the fear came awe. Wild sunflowers tilted their faces toward the light. A hawk wheeled lazily overhead. Grass bent in waves that looked alive. A sea without water. Elias handled the reins with ease, a man at home in such vastness. He glanced at her once or twice but didn't press conversation. That silence, respectful and unhurried, was oddly comforting. Clara found herself studying him in the periphery, the sunburnt line of his jaw, the steadiness in his hands, the way he carried the air of someone who had nothing to prove and plenty to do. "You'll get used to it," Elias said at last, his voice pitched low to cut through the jangle of the wagon. "First week out here, I thought the land would swallow me whole, but after a while, you start to breathe in time with it." Clara managed a faint smile. "It feels like the world has no walls." "That's near the truth," he said, "though a man builds his own fences quick enough if he wants stock to stay put." His eyes flicked to her, serious now. "Don't let it scare you, Miss Bennett. Out here, wide open means you get to choose which way you'll walk." The words lingered. Choice was something Clara hadn't felt she had in a very long time. By mid-afternoon, the road dipped into a small valley. Ahead, neat rows of buildings appeared like a settlement dropped from the sky. A tall two-story house of whitewash clapboard stood at the center, its porch shaded by a deep roofline. To one side stretched a wide red barn and a bunkhouse with a long front stoop where men lounged in shirt sleeves, tipping their hats as the wagon clattered by. Horses snorted in the corral. Farther out, cattle dotted the hillsides like dark coins on green cloth. "Carter Ranch," Elias said simply. Pride was there, but quiet, the kind that didn't need polish to shine. On the porch, a woman stepped into view, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted towel. She shaded her eyes, peered across the yard, then called out with a voice warm as sunlight. "About time, Elias. If you forgot the yeast again, I swear." Her words cut short when she noticed Clara and the child beside him. Clara's breath caught. This must be Rose Carter, the sister Elias had mentioned. She was near Clara's age, with chestnut hair pinned in a knot already losing its battle against loose curls, and eyes the same startling blue as her brother's. Elias set the brake, lifted Clara's trunk from the wagon bed, then offered a hand to help her down. His touch was brief, businesslike, but steady. "Rose," he said, "this is Miss Clara Bennett and her daughter Lydia. They'll be boarding a while. Miss Bennett's taking kitchen work, if she'll have us." For a heartbeat, Clara thought Rose might object. Instead, Rose's expression softened, almost melted. She descended the porch steps without hesitation and crouched to peek at Lydia. "Well now," she murmured, a smile blooming. "A sweet little peach, if ever I saw one." She extended a cautious finger. Lydia's tiny hand closed around it, the reflex as fierce as survival. Rose looked up, eyes shining. "Miss Bennett, welcome to Carter Ranch. Elias undersells me, but it's true. I'm no cook. If you can keep biscuits from doubling as roofing tiles, you're heaven sent." Clara's laugh escaped before she could stop it, rusty from disuse. Relief swelled in her chest. "I can try." "That's all any of us can," Rose replied, looping her arm through Clara's as if they were already sisters. "Come on, let me show you the cottonwood cabin. We aired it out last week." She shot her brother a look. "Elias, don't scuff the trunk or I'll scuff you." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said mildly, hoisting the heavy case with one hand. The cabin sat just beyond the main house, tucked under two towering cottonwood trees whose leaves shivered even when the air was still. Inside, sunlight fell across a small but tidy space. Iron stove in one corner, a table and two chairs, braided rug, shelves stocked with jars and clean crockery. Against the far wall stood a bed made up in a blue quilt, and beside it, a cradle polished smooth by the passing of many little hands. "My father built that when Elias was born," Rose explained, her tone gentling. "Sturdy as the day he finished it, Lydia will sleep sound." Clara reached out, fingertips brushing the worn rail. For the first time since Boston, tears threatened. She blinked fast, not wanting to seem weak, but her voice cracked anyway. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how to repay such kindness." Rose squeezed her hand. Kindness don't need paying back, only passing along. They settled Lydia in the cradle, and the baby sighed into a deeper sleep, as if even she recognized safety. Clara sat on the bed, bone-tired, while Rose chattered about supper, chores, and the harvest social coming in 2 weeks. The words washed over Clara like water, steady and ordinary. She had almost forgotten what ordinary felt like. By evening, Clara had rolled up her sleeves and tied on an apron. Rose hovered nearby as Clara sifted flour and cut in lard for biscuits, explaining as she went. "Not too much mixing? Biscuits sulk if you handle them rough." Rose laughed, delighted by the lesson, and promised to remember. When Elias came in from the yard, he stopped just inside the door, sniffing the air. "Smells like mercy in here," he said reverently. Rose rolled her eyes. "Don't encourage her. Set the table, brother." Supper was beef stew thick with onions and potatoes, biscuits that rose golden and proud, and coffee dark as tar. They ate in the main room, windows open to the prairie dusk. Conversation meandered, cattle prices, a neighbor's broken plow, the new preacher's fondness for long sermons. Afterward, Elias crouched by the cradle, waiting for Clara's nod before lifting Lydia. He held the baby with the practiced ease that made Clara's chest ache. "Howdy, little one," he murmured, as though greeting an equal. Lydia's gurgle was soft as creek water. The night drew down slow. Crickets fiddled in the grass, coyotes called from the hills. Stars came sharp and countless overhead, the kind Clara had only read about in sailors' logs. Standing outside the cabin, she tipped her face upward, and for the first time in months, her lungs filled all the way down. Rose leaned against the doorway, towel draped over her shoulder. "They posted notice today," she said. "Harvest social in 2 weeks. Pie auction, fiddles, men pretending they know how to dance." Clara laughed quietly. "I don't have anything suitable to wear." "Then we'll see Mrs. Harlan at the Mercantile. She owes me a favor. You'll come." Clara didn't answer right away. She traced the porch railing, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingertips. Beyond the yard, Elias's shadow moved as he checked the stock one last time. The sight of him against the horizon, solid, steady, anchored her in a way she hadn't expected. That night, she tucked Lydia into the cradle and lay down on the bed. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and soap. Outside, the cottonwoods whispered like guardians. For the first time since Boston, she whispered words not of despair, but of hope. "We'll be all right, sweet girl. Somehow, we'll be all right." And as she closed her eyes, the prairie night wrapped her in its vast, quiet promise. The town of Abilene looked different when one rode into it not as a stranger stepping off a train, but as part of a wagon drawn by Carter Ranch horses. Clara sat on the bench beside Rose 2 weeks later, Lydia bundled in her arms while Elias handled the team. The August sun had softened into September, but the air was still warm enough to raise a sheen on her skin beneath the blue cotton dress Rose had loaned her. It was a market day, and the main street was busy. Farm wives with baskets, children chasing each other in dust, men talking cattle prices outside the saloon. yet Clara could feel eyes shift toward her, whispers, nothing loud enough to reach her ears, but unmistakable all the same. She held Lydia closer. Ahoy! The baby's small bonnet brushing her chin. A mother's instinct told her every glance carried judgment. A widow they might have pitied. A deserted bride perhaps gossiped over but forgiven. But a woman alone with a child and no ring. Clara knew the look of disapproval from Boston parlors too well. Rose leaned closer, her voice brisk as she gestured toward the storefronts. That's the post office. Next door's Mrs. Harlan's Mercantile. You'll see her pies win at the Harvest Social every year, though I swear she cheats the crust with lard. And over there, the blacksmith. Good man, sings hymns while he works. Don't mind folks staring. Small towns thrive on chatter the way crops thrive on rain. Clara managed a nod, though her throat was tight. They stopped first at the Mercantile. Inside, the smell of coffee beans and molasses wrapped around her like a comfort she didn't expect. Mrs. Harlan herself bustled from behind the counter, apron flour-dusted, cheeks flushed. Rose Carter, and this must be Miss Bennett I've been hearing about, she said brightly, her eyes landing on Lydia with obvious warmth. Well now, isn't she darling? Oh, I could just eat those cheeks. Clara blinked, relief washing over her at the woman's open kindness. Thank you. This is Lydia. And you're helping Rose in the kitchen, I hear? Mrs. Harlan said approvingly. Lord knows the Carters need it. Elias would live on beef jerky and black coffee if left to himself. And Rose, dear, I love you, but your biscuits. Don't you start, Rose said, mock warning. They laughed together, and for a moment Clara almost forgot the stairs outside. She selected some cloth and a new hairbrush, carefully counting coins, but when Elias strode up to the counter and quietly told Mrs. Harlan to put it on his account, Clara felt the heat of embarrassment climb her neck again. Mr. Carter, please, she began. He shook his head, calm and immovable as stone. Advance on wages, nothing more. Before she could argue further, the Mercantile bell jingled. A pair of women entered, their dresses finer than most, their hair piled in careful coils. One was Mrs. Pritchard, the banker's wife Clara had glimpsed before, her plum silk gown gleaming even in the Kansas light. Her companion, thinner and sharper-faced, leaned close to whisper the moment she spotted Clara. Mrs. Pritchard, Elias greeted evenly, tipping his hat. Mr. Carter, she replied, her smile polite and cold. Then her gaze slid to Clara. And this must be your housekeeper. Clara stiffened. Rose's hand touched her elbow in quiet solidarity. Miss Bennett, Elias said, his voice steady, has been hired to assist my sister. She's a guest at Carter Ranch. How generous, Mrs. Pritchard murmured. One does hope generosity is not mistaken for impropriety, but I suppose time will tell. Her eyes flicked deliberately to Lydia. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. She lowered her gaze, wishing the floorboards would swallow her whole. Mrs. Pritchard, Elias said, his tone carrying steel beneath courtesy. Abilene doesn't run on gossip. It runs on good work and good neighbors. Miss Bennett has already proved herself both. Mrs. Pritchard arched a brow, but said no more, turning away with her friend to examine bolts of calico. Clara forced herself to breathe. When she dared glance up, Elias's eyes were on her, not pitying, but steady, like an anchor set against the current. Something unspoken passed between them, and though her pride still smarted, she felt a flicker of gratitude. They finished their errands quickly, but outside, trouble waited. A group of cowhands spilled from the saloon, laughter rough-edged and loud. One of them, broad-shouldered, hat tipped low, spotted Clara and veered toward them. His grin showed too many teeth. Well, if it isn't the Lady Mallory left at the depot, he drawled. His eyes raked over Clara, then dropped to Lydia in her arms. Brought a little baggage with you too, I see. Clara froze. Rose stepped forward sharply. That's enough, Frank Dawson. Frank smirked. What? Just making conversation. Figure if Mallory didn't want her, maybe someone else. He got no further. A strong hand clamped his shoulder, yanking him backward. Elias loomed, taller, broader, his expression thundercloud dark. Apologize, Elias said quietly, though the steel in his voice left no room for refusal. Frank's grin faltered. Now, Ross, I was just funnin'. Apologize, Elias repeated, his tone colder than a January wind. The other cowhands shifted uneasily. Dawson muttered, Sorry, Miss Bennett. Miss Carter, Elias released him with a shove. Get back inside before you find yourself short a few teeth. Frank retreated, muttering curses, but none dared linger. Clara's hands shook as she clutched Lydia, who had begun to fuss at the raised voices. Her chest felt hollow, shame and humiliation churning with something else. Anger. You all right? Elias asked, his voice softer now, gentled for her alone. She steadied herself, rocked Lydia, and forced the tremor from her voice. Yes, just startled. Rose's expression was sharp enough to cut glass. You see why you need to stand tall, Clara. Folks like Frank thrive on weakness. Best thing you can do is keep your chin high and show them you won't break. Clara nodded, though her stomach still churned. She hated being the subject of town gossip, hated that her mere presence seemed to drag Elias and Rose into the line of fire. For a moment, she wondered if she should leave Carter Ranch before her scandal stained them further. But then she glanced at Elias. He was watching her, his jaw set, his eyes steady and certain, not with pity, not with shame, with something stronger, something that said he had no intention of letting her stand alone. As the wagon turned out of town, leaving whispers behind, Clara felt the prairie open around her again, wide and endless. Fear still pressed heavy on her heart, but a seed of something else had been planted, fragile but alive. Hope. The invitation arrived the way news travels on the prairie, half announced, half assumed. By the end of the week, every woman in Abilene seemed to be discussing the harvest social as if attendance were ordained by the weather. Lanterns had already been cleaned and trimmed for hanging in the town hall. The fiddler's wife was boiling sugar for candy apples. Someone swore the Methodist ladies had a secret recipe for lemonade that could charm the horns off a bull. At Carter Ranch, the news came by way of Rose, who pushed open the cabin door after breakfast, arms full of patterns and a bowl of deep green cotton. Don't argue, she said, setting everything down on the table. You're coming. If I have to drag you like a stubborn mule, you're still coming. Clara glanced from the fabric to Lydia, who blinked up at them from a quilt on the floor, gumming the ear of a stuffed rabbit. Rose, I'm not sure. You're sure, Rose decided for her. You need a new dress and a night off from worrying how strangers measure your worth. Also, I refuse to be the only woman on that dance floor who can't keep time. You're going to stand next to me and make me look better by comparison. Clara couldn't help a smile, small but real. That's a terrible plan. It's the plan we've got. Rose flicked open her measuring tape. Arms out. Clara lifted her chin and obeyed. The cotton was cool under Rose's hands as she pinned and marked, stepping back every so often to squint, adjust, and nod. Outside, the late September wind rattled the cottonwoods along the creek. Inside, Lydia burbled, thoroughly pleased with her rabbit. The ordinary rhythm of the morning, dough rising on the stove, coffee cooling in a tin cup, Rose muttering about hems, was so domestic, so peaceful, that Clara nearly forgot she had been the target of whispers in town only days before. Green, Rose said, tapping the fabric. It'll bring out your eyes. And before you ask, it's on Elias's account. Clara opened her mouth, closed it again. Rose, wages advance, Rose said briskly. He's stubborn as an ox, but fair as they come. Let folks talk if they must. We answer with how we live, not what they say. The end of that afternoon, with Lydia napping, Clara sat by the cabin window and hand-stitched the bodice while the light shifted across the table. Her mind pinged between practical matters, where Lydia would sleep during the social, whether she could do something with her hair besides pin it into a battle with itself, and the quieter, thornier tangle she avoided naming. It had a shape, though, a man's steady voice, a way he'd stepped between her and a drunk without raising his voice or his fist, blue eyes that could be hard as river rock or as soft as dusk. Elias appeared at the door with a polite rap just as she tied off a seam. He held something wrapped in a square of muslin. For Lydia, he said. Clara folded back the cloth. Nestled inside lay a tiny wooden horse, polished, smooth, its mane and tail carved with careful grooves. The ears were just rounded enough that a curious baby wouldn't cut her gums. The simple grace of it stole Clara's breath. You made this, she said, not a question. He shrugged, faintly embarrassed. Keeps my hands busy when the day slows. She turned the horse in her palm, felt its weight. It's beautiful. I thought she might like it when she's older. His mouth quirked. Or chew it to a nub now. Either way, their gaze tangled, an instant, then another, before she looked down, smoothing the muslin. Thank you. He cleared his throat. About the social. If you'd be willing, I'd be honored to escort you. Warmth rose, bright and ungovernable, to her cheeks. I'd like that very much. His answering smile, brief, unguarded, lit his whole face. Good. Mrs. Alvarez says she'll keep Lydia. She raised 6 boys. Claims one baby will feel like a vacation. That woman is fearless, Clara said, grateful laughter easing a tightness she didn't know she'd been carrying. More than we are combined, Elias agreed, and tipped his head, leaving her alone with the wooden horse and the unsteady thrum of her own heart. The town hall bloomed with light and sound on Saturday evening, lanterns swinging from rafters and pine boughs draped along the walls. The floor had been swept until it shone. Fiddle, guitar, and a single battered banjo tuned in the corner, while the potluck tables bowed under the weight of pies, biscuits, fried chicken, and something a Mrs. Harlan swore were Boston baked beans, but better. Clara paused in the doorway, the deep green dress smooth beneath her palms, her hair coiled and pinned at the nape of her neck with Rose's steady help. Elias stood just behind her, his presence a warm certainty at her shoulder, dressed in a black coat and starched white shirt that made him look, just for tonight, more town gentleman than cattleman. I don't have to do this, she whispered. You don't, he said simply, but if you want to, I'm here. She took a breath, another, then stepped forward. Conversations dipped and lifted around them like wind over grass. People turned, curious and assessing. The banker's wife, Mrs. Pritchard, wore burgundy silk and a smile that cut. Sheriff Morgan was present too, mustache combed, eyes missing nothing. A row of old-timers along the wall chewed the same wad of tobacco they'd been nursing since the war and nodded faintly as if to say, "Well now, let's see." Rose swooped in with the save, planting a kiss on Clara's cheek. "You're a picture," she declared, "and if I step on your toes later, pretend I meant to." "Never," Elias said dryly. "You'll blame me." "Correct," Rose said unabashedly, then sailed off to greet the preacher's wife. Clara and Elias set their pies on the food table. People approached and drifted away. Greetings tendrilled with speculation. Most were friendly, some were cautious. One woman, the blacksmith's wife, squeezed Clara's hand and said, "You cooked those biscuits I heard about? God bless you. My Tom says they made him see heaven." And before Clara could answer, a familiar perfume, too sweet by half, announced Mrs. Pritchard. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly. "Miss Bennet. How lovely you both look." Her gaze dipped to the plain gold locket at Clara's throat, then to the neat stitches at her hem, searching for flaws. "It's admirable to see. Community spirit extended to those in need." Clara felt the barb in the velvet of the words. Elias's voice stayed courteous. "Harvest comes for all of us, Mrs. Pritchard. Seems only right we gather together for it." "But of course," the woman murmured. "And how is your little one, Miss Bennet?" Clara lifted her chin. "Sleeping peacefully. Thank you." Mrs. Pritchard said, as if that answered everything, and drifted away on the rustle of her skirts. Clara let out a breath. Elias offered a cup of punch. "You did fine," he said. "She fishes. You don't have to bite." "I'm learning," Clara said, and almost smiled. The music struck up, a reel lively enough to lift the corners of the room. Elias turned to her, extended a hand. "Would you do me the honor?" She hesitated only long enough to feel the old fear. A second skin, then placed her fingers in his palm. His hand was warm, steady, the calluses familiar and reassuring. He led her into the dance with quiet confidence, not jerking or pushing, just guiding, letting the music find their feet. Her body remembered steps learned long before Boston turned its back. A turn, a glide, a half smile at the spin of lantern light across the floor. "You dance well," he said. "You don't stomp," she teased, and then laughed at herself, surprised to find she could. "High praise," he deadpanned, and she laughed again, unguarded this time, and some of the watching faces softened by a shade. They danced twice, then stood with Rose and the blacksmith's wife, sampling Mrs. Harlan's improvement on beans. Sheriff Morgan ambled closer, hat in hand. "Evening," he said, eyes kind. "Miss Bennet, you look well." "Thank you, Sheriff." He lowered his voice just enough. Word off the telegraph says James Mallory's made himself scarce round Dodge. Heard he headed west on a fast horse and a bad idea. Folks mentioned swindling miners in Colorado territory, maybe California. The name snapped through Clara like a cold wire. She kept her face still through a sheer act of will. I see. No need to worry none, the sheriff added. Abilene's a long way from whatever trouble he's digging now. He nodded at Elias. You keep an eye out, as you do. Always, Elias said. The music shifted to a slower tune, soft as twilight. Elias glanced to the door, then back to her. Too warm in here? Very, Clara said, grateful to put space between her and the ghost of a name. They stepped into the cool evening. The night smelled of dust and pine sap and the faint sweetness of cut hay. Overhead, stars pricked the blue. The muffled fiddle drifted from the hall, but the street itself was nearly empty, just the creak of a sign in the breeze and a dog nosing a doorstep. They walked toward the cottonwood at the edge of town without speaking. When they reached its shade, Clara touched the rough bark, grounding herself. Elias waited, hands open at his sides, not crowding, not pressing. I told people in Boston that Lydia was my sister's child, Clara said finally. The words came slow, unspooling from a place she kept barred. They believe me because it was easier, for them and for me. Easier than seeing me for what I was, what I am. His voice was calm. What are you? A mother out of wedlock. She met his gaze squarely. Lydia is mine, Elias, my daughter. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. I know. She blinked. You knew. I suspected the day I met you, and I knew by the time you had her asleep on your shoulder in the mercantile. He lifted one shoulder in a modest shrug. There's a way a mother watches her child. A man can tell if he's paying attention. Heat burned behind her eyes, humiliation, relief, something perilously like gratitude. Why didn't you say anything? It wasn't my truth to force, he said simply. I figured you'd hand it to me when you were ready. She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. Her father promised things, then denied me. His family turned me out. I made choices after that I wish I hadn't, except they led me here, to the station, to you. The words hung between them, fragile as a spun glass ornament. Elias stepped closer, deliberately, giving her time to step back if she wanted. She didn't. Clara, he said, saying her name like a promise. I don't give a damn what Boston thinks. I care what's true. You are brave and you are good. Lydia is your daughter, and that makes her precious. You both are. Her throat went tight. People will talk. They already do. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Let 'em wear themselves out. Meanwhile, we'll keep doing what's right, and let time do the rest. She swallowed, lifted a trembling hand, and set her fingers lightly against his coat, where his heartbeat thudded slow and steady beneath. I didn't think I'd ever hear a man say that to me without wanting something in return. I want plenty, he said, a spark of humor in his eyes, but only what you're willing to give, on your terms, in your time. Courage rose, small but stubborn, in her chest. And if I wanted this? What's that? This, she said, and rose to kiss him. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderbolts, just the taste of mint and warmth, and the careful way he gentled his hand along her jaw like she was something precious he'd found in the grass. It was the steadiness that undid her. Oh, yeah. The certainty that he wasn't surprised by tenderness, that he had room for it in a life measured by long days and hard work. When they drew apart, he leaned his forehead to hers, breath misting the space between them. We should get back, he murmured. Mrs. Pritchard might have a fainting spell if we leave her without something to speculate on. Clara laughed, a wet sound that tipped toward joy. Let her faint. We have a baby to check on. They returned to the hall hand in hand. Rose caught their clasped fingers and arched a single eyebrow so high it threatened to leave her face. Elias answered with the smallest nod. Rose's grin exploded like sunrise. They didn't stay long. The social would reel on into the night, but Mrs. Alvarez's lamp was still burning in her kitchen window when Elias and Clara walked up the ranch lane, and Lydia slept soft and heavy in the older woman's arms. Perfect angel, Mrs. Alvarez whispered, passing the baby into Clara's embrace. You go to bed. Tomorrow is another day to be brave. Clara pressed her lips to Lydia's crown, breathing in milk and soap and the ineffable smell that was only her daughter. Through the open door, she could hear the quiet movements of the ranch settling for the night. A horse's soft snort, boots thunking onto a porch, someone laughing low and tired. Elias paused on the cabin threshold. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Elias." He tipped his hat, then hesitated. "You did fine," he said again, and something in his voice made the words bigger, like a benediction. After he'd gone, Clara stood in the middle of the little room and rocked Lydia while the lantern hissed, and the wooden horse waited on the table where the moonlight could find it. She thought of the cottonwood's shadow, the steady beat under her palm, the simple way he'd said "I know" and meant "I accept." People would talk. Let them. Tomorrow she would cook breakfast for a dozen men, and Rose would tease her mercilessly, and the world would keep turning. But tonight, in the hush after music and before dawn, Clara let herself believe that second chances were not a fairy tale for other people. They were here, stubborn as prairie grass, taking root in the hard ground and holding. And she and Lydia were, finally, exactly where they were meant to be. Autumn had deepened on the prairie, painting the grasses gold and copper under a sky sharpened by cooler winds. Mornings at Carter Ranch began with the breath of frost on the windows and the smell of coffee rising before dawn. Clara found herself slipping into a rhythm she hadn't known she craved. Bread set to rise at first light. Lydia bundled against her hip while she stirred stew, the chatter of ranch hands grateful for biscuits that didn't crack their teeth. It was honest work, and with every passing day, she felt the weight of Boston's shadows ease. Still, beneath the surface, unease stirred. Not every neighbor wished her well. Not every whisper had softened. And some men, emboldened by drink and gossip, carried grudges as heavy as any load of hay. One crisp afternoon, Clara stood in the yard hanging linens when Tommy, the youngest hand at the ranch, came loping up from the north ridge, cheeks flushed and breath ragged. "Mr. Carter," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Smoke, up by the ridge line." Elias emerged from the barn at once, striding forward, hat pulled low against the glare. "Where?" Tommy pointed, arms shaking. "East pasture, near the draw. Look set fast." Elias's jaw tightened. "Round up the men. Get buckets, shovels, anything that'll throw dirt. Move." Within moments, the bunkhouse emptied. Men raced to the ridge, yanking horses from their diz, grabbing tools, boots thudding against the packed earth. Elias swung into the saddle with practiced speed, his voice carrying like a bell across the yard. "Rose, keep the house wet down. Clara." He reined his horse toward her, eyes sharp. "Stay with Lydia. Keep her safe." Clara's throat dried. "What if the fire spreads this way?" His gaze held hers steady and fierce. "Then you take her and run south for the river. Don't look back. Understand?" She nodded, clutching Lydia, though fear burned hotter than the smoke already staining the horizon. Elias spurred his horse, and in a spray of dirt he was gone, galloping toward the rising plume. The fire had started from a careless spark. Later, they would learn Dawson's boys had been drinking and left a campfire smoldering. By the time Elias and the men reached the ridge, flames had leapt the dry grass, snarling like a wild beast. Buckets of water and wet burlap were pitiful against the wall of heat. But the Carters and their neighbors fought with desperation, beating down sparks, digging trenches, their shouts carried by the wind. From the yard, Clara could see the haze rising, orange against the blue. Her stomach knotted with every gust that sent sparks tumbling closer. She soaked every rag she had, hung wet sheets against the porch, and prayed. Rose worked beside her, arms slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. "Don't worry," Rose panted, slapping water across the boards. "This land's tougher than it looks, and so's my brother." Clara swallowed hard. "I've never seen fire like that." "You will, if you stay," Rose said grimly. "Prairie takes and gives both. But Elias, he won't let it take more than it must." The hours dragged. Lydia whimpered in her cradle, fussing against the smoke. Clara sang to her softly, voice raw, trying to steady herself as much as the child. She had promised, she told herself, she would run if she had to, but part of her knew if Elias didn't come back, if the ridge swallowed him, running would be hollow. At dusk, riders returned, blackened with soot, eyes bloodshot from smoke. Elias was among them, shirt scorched, hair plastered to his brow with sweat. He swung down from his horse, exhaustion pulling his frame low, But his first glance was toward the cabin. Clara was already there, Lydia in her arms. Relief struck her so hard she nearly stumbled. Elias reached them in 3 long strides, one hand gripping the doorframe as if to keep himself upright. "It's out," he rasped. His voice was raw, cracked by smoke. "Ridge is black, but it won't spread farther." Clara pressed Lydia against him before she could stop herself. The baby reached toward his soot-streaked face, patting with chubby fingers. Elias closed his eyes briefly, bowing his head. "Thank God," he whispered. "You could have been." The words caught in Clara's throat. "I thought—" He opened his eyes again, blue even against the ash. "I told you I'd come back." That night, after the men were fed and the ranch quieted, Elias sat on the porch steps, Boots at his side, face washed, but still shadowed by weariness. Clara brought him coffee, her hands trembling only a little. "Thank you," he said, taking the cup. His voice was low, the way men speak when the world has nearly taken them and they are still counting the cost. "You saved it," she said quietly. "The ranch. The land." He shook his head. "Men saved it. I only let 'em where the fire needed beating." He sipped, then studied her. "You kept the house wet?" "Yes." She hesitated. "You told me to run if it came to that." "And you would have," he said firmly, as though by will alone he could make it true. Clara sat beside him, the night pressing close, Lydia asleep inside. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid the fire would take everything. Afraid you wouldn't come back." Elias set the cup aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Fear's natural. Courage is moving anyway. You did that, and I came back." Her gaze lingered on him, on the strength carved by fire and toil. "What if you hadn't? Then the land would still grow back, and you'd go on because of Lydia." And he paused, then added more softly, "But I'm not much for what-ifs. I'm here. That's enough." For Clara, it was both too little and more than she dared hope. She folded her hands in her lap, but the tremor wouldn't stop. "When you say things like that, it feels like you expect nothing. Like you don't know how much it means." Elias turned, eyes steady. "I know. Maybe more than you think. Fire takes, Clara. I've seen it. Disease takes, floods, drought, men's cruelty. None of it asks permission. So when I say I'm here, I mean I choose to be. Every day." Her breath caught. The words weren't grand, but they held more weight than any oath she had ever heard. The silence stretched, filled only by crickets and the distant low of cattle. Then Elias reached across the narrow space, his soot-roughened hand covering hers. Not pressing, not demanding, just holding, warm and certain. Clara didn't pull away. By morning, word had spread across Abilene that Carter Ranch had held the fire. Neighbors came to clap Elias on the shoulder, to praise the men, to speak of luck and grit. But whispers lingered too, about Dawson's part in it, about a woman from Boston cooking in the Carter kitchen, about what Elias's steady glances meant. Clara heard them when she rode into town with Rose for flour. She felt the eyes, the measuring, the judgment. But something in her had shifted. She remembered the ridge burning red against the sky, the way Elias had returned ash dark, but alive, the way his hand had steadied hers in the night. For the first time, she thought, let them talk. She had faced fire. She could face them too. The morning after the fire carried a hush, as if the prairie itself were catching its breath. A veil of gray ash powdered the fence rails, and the wind smelled faintly of smoke. Clara swept the porch with measured strokes, while Lydia napped, each push of the broom a steadying rhythm. She kept seeing the ridge lit like a forge, kept hearing Elias's voice. "I'm here. I choose to be." The words had rooted in her in a way she didn't quite dare name. Rose came out with a coffee tin and 2 mugs. "I told old Pete to keep the hands at fence line till noon," she said, pouring. "Elias wants eyes up there in case the wind turns." Clara nodded, taking a cup to warm her fingers. "Does the town know it's contained?" "By now." "Likely the feed store has 5 versions of last night, and none of 'em true," Rose said wryly. She studied Clara's face. "You hardly slept." "Neither did you." "Difference is, my brother's been charging headlong into flames since he was 12. Rose tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You, on the other hand, are learning the Carter way." Her tone gentled. "It's not just the fire, though, is it?" Clara stared down at the coffee's dark surface. The truth was heavy and simple and long overdue. I can't ask your brother for a future if I won't tell him my past. Rose's mouth curved in something like relief. Then tell him. What if the telling changes his mind about me? Truth has a way of sorting who belongs and who doesn't. Rose set her cup down. Elias isn't a man who scares easy. She glanced toward the barn. He's checking the pumps. Go on. The sooner it's said, the sooner it stops owning you. Clara's heart gathered itself. She wiped her palms on her apron and crossed the yard. She found Elias in the shade of the pump shed, wrench in one hand, soot still faint along the line of his jaw. He looked up when she approached, something unreadable and warm flickering through his tired eyes. Morning, he said. Pump's good. We'll run water to the back trough again by midday. His gaze sharpened. You all right? No, she said truthfully, standing straighter. But I need to be. He set the wrench aside, attention turning fully to her. Say it plain, then. Clara took a breath that trembled at the edges. The story I told when I came, about Lydia being my sister's child, was a lie. She is my daughter. Elias didn't react, didn't blink. If anything, the air between them steadied. I know, he said quietly. Her breath hitched. You knew. I suspected, he amended. From the way you hold her like your ribs are built around her, from the way the truth sat behind your eyes. Figured it would come when you were ready. Clara pressed a hand to the pump post, hot shame and gratefulness warring in her chest. Her father was the son of the family I worked for in Boston. He promised he'd marry me when the timing was convenient, when his father's business survived a bad season, when his mother's nerves recovered, when... She shook her head. The timing stayed inconvenient until he could deny it outright. They dismissed me without a reference. The boarding house took me in so long as Lydia would be called a niece. She forced the last admission out steady. I answered an advertisement to marry a man out here. He didn't meet the train. Clara, Elias said, her name anchoring. I wanted to tell you sooner, but every time I tried, I saw the way folks look at me in town. I couldn't bear to see it in your eyes. He stepped closer. Look, he said simply, and he let her, not hiding from her study. All she found there was a quiet mixture of sorrow and something like pride. He lifted a hand and then waited, palm open between them, asking. She placed hers in his and felt the grounding of callus and heat. I'm not ashamed of Lydia, she said, tears stinging despite herself. I'm ashamed of my fear. You had cause, he answered, but you're not the only one with ghosts. His thumb brushed her knuckles. I was engaged once. Lucinda. Spring flood took her crossing Miller's Creek. She was sunshine and motion, and then, one day, she wasn't. For a long time I kept the world small as a tackhead, so it wouldn't get ripped away again. Clara swallowed. I'm sorry. I am too, he said without self-pity. But I learned grief doesn't keep you safe. It just keeps you alone. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What now, then? Now that it's said. Now, Elias replied. We choose what belongs. He squeezed her hand once and let it go, not caging her, not pushing. I'm courting you, Clara Mitchell. I have been since the day you stepped off that train holding that baby like she was the best thing God ever made. Your truth doesn't change my mind. If anything, it sets it firmer. Her laugh caught on a sob. You make it sound so simple. Simple and easy ain't the same, he said, the corner of his mouth ticking. But I'm no kind of man if I let other folks talk run my life. A shout from the lane cut across the moment. Bootsteps clapped the packed dirt. Carter! Sheriff Talbot's voice carried before he appeared, dust coating his duster. You might want to come hear this yourself. Elias's shoulders narrowed. What is it? Frank Dawson, the sheriff said grimly. He's in town running his mouth about last night. Says the fire was your fault. Some nonsense about you burning your own fence line to collect from the railroad, and he's dragging Miss Mitchell's name into it. Says you've put a Boston girl in your kitchen for reasons other than cooking. Heat rose bright and cold in Clara's veins. Elias's expression didn't change, but the set of his jaw did. I told him to shut it, Talbot went on. He didn't. The church ladies are organizing a relief dinner on the green at noon for the men who fought the fire. If you want to put this to rest in one go, that's where folks will be. Rose had reached them by then, eyes flint. Then we go. Elias looked to Clara, giving her the choice utterly. You don't owe anyone your story, he said. Not them, Not me. Clara thought of hiding, of silence, of the way fear narrows a life until there's no room left for joy. She lifted her chin. I've kept quiet long enough. Elias nodded once. We'll go together. The town green was already crowded when they arrived, tables under cottonwoods, quilts spread in the patchy shade, platters of fried chicken and beans, the bandstand strung with bunting bleached by years of use. Soot-streaked men were treated like returning soldiers, slapped backs, pressed hands, extra slices of pie. The smell of smoke hadn't yet burned away, and the gossip hadn't either. Eyes followed Clara as she and Rose crossed the grass with a tray of biscuits and honey. Elias walked beside them, hat brim low, not touching her but near enough to feel like shelter. They hadn't taken 3 steps before Frank Dawson slid from a knot of men near the lemonade barrel, whiskey already riding his breath, though the sun hadn't reached its peak. Well now, he drawled loud enough to carry, the Carter outfit. Brought your cook, I see. His gaze raked Clara, insolent. Or is there some other title we should use for you, Miss from Boston? The space around them softened and widened, the way towns do when a spectacle is about to bloom. Sheriff Talbot appeared at the edge of the circle, jaw working. He didn't move in yet. He was giving them a chance to handle it without irons. Clara's pulse rattled her ribs, but she held Frank's gaze. Miss Mitchell will do. Seems a lot of things will do around Carter Ranch these days, Frank said, smiling at the laughs it won from 2 of his hangers-on. Heard last night's fire was mighty convenient for a man looking for attention. Mighty convenient for a woman wanting a husband to rescue her. Elias stepped forward, voice even. You're going to apologize, Dawson. Apologize? Frank barked a laugh. For telling the truth about a woman who shows up with a babe and no ring, then takes up in a bachelor's kitchen? Folks ain't blind, Carter. Clara felt the old shame rise like bile. She felt Rose's hand press between her shoulders, a steadying warmth. She felt Elias's nearness like a wall. She thought of the pump shed, of a hand offered and her name spoken like a promise. She looked past Frank to the clutches of women, to Mrs. Abernathy with her pearls tight on her throat, to Maria Torres from the railroad camp, wrangling 3 little ones while balancing a casserole on her hip. She thought, if I don't say it, he says it for me forever. Clara stepped into the open space and found her voice. You want truth? She said, and the hum of talk thinned. Here it is. Lydia is my daughter. I left Boston because the man who fathered her found his spine only long enough to lie. I came here because a newspaper promised a new start. That promise broke at the depot. I would have slept under the platform if Sheriff Talbot hadn't found Mr. Carter for me. He offered a job. He offered decency. He has shown me nothing else since. In a ripple moved through the crowd. Surprise, then silence, so complete even the flies seemed to hold still. Mrs. Abernathy's lips parted, words forming and failing. Maria Torres's dark eyes shone. Sheriff Talbot tipped his hat almost imperceptibly. Frank's smirk wavered, then returned, thinner. So there it is. Sin wrapped up in fancy words. Careful, Elias said, his voice quiet enough to draw attention rather than blast it away. You keep using that word while you're smelling of whiskey at a church dinner, and the Reverend might see fit to educate you. Laughter flickered, grateful and sharp. Reverend Hale, lean, sun-weathered, had edged closer. My, did that, he said mildly. The good book has plenty to say about stones, and who should be throwing them. Frank bristled. So you're all right with this? Her past? I'm all right with telling the whole of a person, the Reverend replied, and with a town remembering it's not a jury. Frank looked to the men behind him for backing and found less than he'd counted on. Fire Change's men, the ones who'd watched Elias ride the line last night, were less eager to haul him down in daylight. Dawson blustered, stepped toward Clara 1 pace too far. Elias moved that same pace, placing himself between them with an ease that said he'd do it 1,000 times and never counted a sacrifice. Leave, he told Frank. You don't run this town, Frank spat. No, Elias said, but I do run my temper, which is why you're upright and breathing. For now. Sheriff Talbot finally intervened, clapping a heavy hand on Dawson's shoulder. You've said your say. Now take yourself home, drink water, and come back when you can stand near decent folks without souring the air. Frank jerked free, embarrassed and angry, and stalked off toward the street, his men shuffling after him. The circle loosened. Conversation started up again like a river finding its channel. Clara stood very still, breath trembling, waiting for the second wave, judgment delivered in softer voices. Instead, Maria Torres came first, setting her casserole down on the nearest table and taking Clara's hands in both of hers. "Your girl is beautiful," Maria said simply. "If you ever need anything, sugar, a cradle, a woman to sit with you when the fever comes, I am 2 doors down from the smithy." Mrs. Abernathy approached next, pearls shining hard in the noon sun. She cleared her throat. "Miss Mitchell," she began, and it sounded like it pained her to use the honorific. Well, the pies your kitchen sent last night were appreciated." Her chin lifted. "And Mr. Carter's men saved my son's fence line when the wind turned. That is, not nothing." "It's something," Rose said dryly behind Clara. "It is something," Mrs. Abernathy conceded, then nodded once and retreated to the comfort of the lemonade line. The Reverend stepped close enough that only the 4 of them could hear, Clara, Elias, Rose, and the sheriff, lingering like a sentinel. "Truth, spoken clean, has a way of pulling splinters," he said gently. "You did right." Clara swallowed, unable to speak past the sudden ache in her throat. Elias's hand brushed the small of her back, barely there but steady as the horizon. "Thank you," Clara managed to the Reverend. To the sheriff. "And you." Talbot tipped his hat again. "You did your own heavy lifting," he said, then moved to break up an argument about whose beans were best, which seemed a safer problem for a lawman. "Hungry?" Elias asked Clara after a beat. Voice turned practical again in a way that felt like care. "You face down half the county. That'll burn through a biscuit or two." She laughed, soft, shaky, real. "Starving." They filled plates and ate on the edge of the green beneath a pin oak. Lydia woke from her nap in the crook of Clara's arm and blinked at the world as if finding it acceptable after all. Rose wandered off to scold Tommy into washing before he touched the peach cobbler. Elias watched Clara without crowding her. "How's your breathing?" he asked, as if fear were a kind of asthma you learned to manage by degrees. "Better," she admitted. "It's strange saying it out loud." "Didn't break you," he finished. "No," she said, and a bright, almost giddy relief broke across her face. "It didn't." They were quiet for a time, listening to the band fumble a hymn into a reel. A gust shook loose a few ash-gray leaves. Clara traced a circle on Lydia's shoulder and felt something settle in her bones. Place. Promise. The shape of a life not built on hiding. Elias cleared his throat, thumb whirring the edge of his plate like a man bracing for a new kind of risk. "I meant what I said at the pump shed," he began. "I'm courting you. I'll do it slow, in daylight, with the whole town watching if that makes it easier. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll ask you to marry me." His voice didn't crack, but a roughness lived in it, honest as cedar. "I won't rush you. I won't rush Lydia, but I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I want." Clara's eyes pricked again, though the tears that came now were of a different sort. "You're a stubborn man, Elias Carter. Ask anybody," he said, half a smile tugging. "It's a family failing." She set her plate aside, gathered Lydia closer, and turned to face him fully. "If you're courting," she said, trying and failing to keep her voice entirely steady, "then I suppose this is the part where I say yes." "Is it?" he said softly. "It is," she said, and for the first time since Boston, a yes felt like a door opening rather than closing. She tilted forward, careful of the baby between them, and pressed her lips to his cheek, a touch as light as a promise and as sure. When she drew back, his eyes had darkened, not with possessiveness, but with something steadier, warmer. The sort of heat that keeps a home rather than burning it down. Around them, the town returned to its bustle. Laughter, clatter, the scrape of chairs across boards borrowed from the freight depot. People would talk. Of course they would. But now the story was hers to tell. Elias stood and offered his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get Lydia some sun. And after, I'll show you the South Meadow. When the wind's right, you can still smell wild mint where the creek bends." Clara slid her hand into his and rose. The ash in the air had thinned. The light was clean. Somewhere beyond the bandstand, a child shrieked with the careless joy of someone who trusts the world to catch them if they fall. Clara looked at the man beside her, at the town that had heard her truth and kept its feet, at her daughter's small fist curled around her bodice tie, and felt for the first time the shape of a home settling around her like a well-made dress. Not velvet, not lace, but strong seams, good cloth, and room to breathe. "Show me," she said, and they stepped off the green together, the path toward the future already worn by 100 honest choices. Winter crept down from the plains in silver breath and frost-rimed fences. The wind had teeth, rattling the shutters of Carter Ranch, yet inside the house glowed with warmth, lamplight, firelight, laughter. Clara moved easily in that rhythm now, kneading bread while Lydia toddled between her and Rose, stirring stew while Elias set his hat on its peg and leaned in the doorway, his presence as natural as the creak of floorboards. The confession at the harvest social had been a turning point. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they'd shifted, softer, less sharp, often silenced by the same neighbors who once indulged them. Truth, it seemed, had a way of exhausting scandal. Clara found herself walking through Abilene with her head higher, her steps lighter, Lydia perched on her hip like a tiny banner proclaiming, "We belong." Still, Clara carried Boston's scars in her memory. Some nights, when the wind howled against the eaves, she remembered the boarding house, matron pressing a ticket into her hand, the pitying looks, the sharp word ruined, and then she'd hear Elias's voice, steady, unflinching, "I choose to be here." That voice had become her anchor. Snow fell the day Elias asked, not in great drifts, but soft and steady, dusting the pastures and frosting the bare limbs of the cottonwoods. Clara had just tucked Lydia into her crib when Elias appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Come walk with me," he said. She pulled her shawl tighter, slipped on her boots, and followed him into the pale hush. The ranch lay quiet, the cattle penned, smoke curling from chimneys like threads of a tapestry. Elias led her to the ridge above the south meadow, where the wind carried the faint scent of frozen mint under the snow. He stopped, turned, and for a moment only looked at her. The weight of it made her heart beat in her throat. "I told you I'd ask in daylight," he said, voice thick with more than cold. He dropped to one knee in the snow, heedless of the wet seeping into his trousers. "Clara Mitchell, you've stood braver than anyone I've known. Through loss, through fire, through the worst a man like Dawson could say. You've raised a daughter with love that could split stone. I don't want to walk another day of this life without you beside me. Will you marry me?" Her hands flew to her mouth, tears burning hot against the winter air. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, steadier. "Yes, Elias Carter, I will." He rose, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her with a fierceness that carried not just longing, but promise. Lydia's cry drifted from the cabin on the wind, demanding, ordinary, life itself, and they both laughed, breaking the kiss. "She's part of the bargain," Clara said, wiping her cheeks. "Always was," Elias answered. They married in the little white church at Christmas, candles glowing against evergreen boughs. Rose stood proud as witness, Lydia in a white dress with a green ribbon to match her mother's eyes. Sheriff Talbot offered his arm as if Clara were kin, and Reverend Hale spoke of new beginnings, of love forged in fire and tempered by grace. When Elias kissed his bride, even Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a lace kerchief. Frank Dawson didn't attend. He'd ridden out weeks before, leaving debts behind. But Clara hardly noticed. The church was full of neighbors who had fought the fire shoulder to shoulder with Elias, who had tasted her pies, who had seen her stand in the town green and tell her truth without flinching. At the reception in the barn, lanterns swung overhead, and fiddles carried the crowd into laughter. Clara danced once with Elias, once with Rose, and then found herself watching her daughter toddle between ranch hands who bent double to clap for her every wobbling step. Her chest swelled with something she realized was peace, unexpected, undeserved, but hers all the same. The years that followed stitched themselves into a pattern stronger than any one thread. Spring brought calves bawling in the meadow, summer the heavy scent of hay, autumn the glow of the harvest dance now shared as husband and wife. Lydia grew sturdy and bright-eyed, riding before she could read, fearless with a pony Elias had carved a saddle to fit her small frame. 2 more children followed, James quick as a colt and forever chasing the wind, and Ruth quieter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gaze. The cabin that once sheltered Clara alone expanded into a home brimming with quilts, books, and the smell of bread. Clara never forgot the station platform, the emptiness of that first day. She never forgot what it felt like to be abandoned, which was why, when Rose came rattling down the lane one spring with a wagon and a pale girl clutching an infant, Clara didn't hesitate. "She's called Rebecca," Rose explained, climbing down. "Parents turned her out. Nowhere else to go." Clara went to the girl, saw the terror etched in her young face, and recognized it like a mirror of her own past. "You're safe here," Clara said simply. "You and your baby both." Elias came behind her, James balanced on his shoulders, and added in that same steady voice he had used years before, "Every mother deserves a place to stand. Every child deserves a roof." So the old boarding house funds Elias had once suggested became Haven House, a place on the edge of town for women with no place else. Clara ran it with Rose's help, Elias building the stables and the men raising walls. Dozens of women passed through, some staying only long enough to catch their breath, others finding new lives entirely. And every time, Clara remembered the day a man had looked at her on a train platform and said, "Let me hold you both." 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch with Ruth on her hip, watching Elias chase James through the yard while Lydia, solemn and serious at 8, helped Pete brush down her pony. Rose was arriving in her wagon again, books for the children bouncing in the back, and beside her, another girl, nervous, wide-eyed, clutching a bundle too small to be anything but a newborn. Clara smiled, the lines at her eyes deepening with years of laughter and tears. "Another lamb for the fold," she murmured. Elias heard, looked up from the chase, and grinned, breathless. "Then, let's make room!" The girl climbed down uncertainly. Clara went to her, as she always did, with open arms. "Welcome," she said, guiding her toward the porch. "You're home now." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to do. Everyone says I've ruined my life." Clara touched her cheek, gentle and firm. "So, did they tell me once, but they were wrong. Sometimes what feels like the end is just the beginning of the trail." She turned, gesturing to Elias, to the children, to the ranch rolling out behind them in the golden light. "This is what comes after." The girl followed her gaze, saw the laughter, the fields, the steady man with a child perched on his shoulders. Something like hope sparked in her expression. "Come," Clara said softly, leading her up the steps. "Let me introduce you to my husband. He has a soft spot for women with babies who need a hand." Elias doffed his hat, James tugging at his sleeve. "Ma's right," he said. "We always have room." Clara felt Ruth burrow closer against her neck, smelled hay and fresh bread, heard Lydia's laughter ring like a bell across the yard. She looked at Elias, her partner, her anchor, and silently blessed the day a train left her on a dusty platform in Abilene with nothing but a child and a trunk. What had once been shame was now strength. What had once been ruin was now foundation, and what had once been loneliness had become, against every odd, a family. As the sun slid low and the lanterns were lit one by one across the yard, Clara stood in the doorway of her home. Behind her, the murmur of women in Haven House, the scent of stew simmering, the squeals of children playing. Before her, the endless prairie, stretching west into tomorrow. She smiled, the weight of her past still part of her, but no longer defining. She had found her place, her people, her truth. And, in that truth, she had built a life richer than any she could have imagined. Sometimes, she thought, being left behind was the very first step toward finding the trail home.